Hello and welcome to Zoology Live 2020, our first online festival at the Museum of Zoology. I'm Ros Wade, I'm the Learning Officer at the museum, and I'll be your guide on this wonderful week of wildlife. We have a really fantastic set of experts lined up to talk to you on topics from minibeasts to birds, aquatic wildlife to wildlife filmmaking. So loads of really exciting stuff to talk about. If you've got any questions for any of our experts, do post them in the comments on YouTube or send them to us on social media using the hashtag ZoologyLive. We'll also be setting a series of challenges this week. This is where we'd really love you to get involved and share your wildlife sightings and creations with us. Today we'll be setting our wildlife challenge using the website iRecord. There'll be lots of information on that at the end of the show today, and you can also find out more details on that blog. What we'd like you to do today is to turn citizen scientist and help us to collect data to build a picture of the wildlife where we are. So do get involved, sign up to iRecord and log your sightings with us for Zoology Live 2020. Tomorrow we'll be setting our recycled makes challenge. So start gathering together those plastic bottles and scrap paper and card, ready to make those into some fantastic creations. And on Thursday, we'll give you a little bit more information about our Lego challenge. So have a think, what kind of wildlife can I turn into a Lego creation? We would really love to see what you make. Remember, post any of your wildlife sightings and pictures of your creations on our social media using the hashtag ZoologyLive, and you could feature in our show on Saturday. And so to today's show. Now, if you didn't know it, and really you should, it is National Insect Week. This is a celebration by the Royal Entomological Society of all things invertebrate, and so we have not one but 2 days of mini-beasts for you to celebrate. Today we'll be joined by Dr. Ed Turner, our Curator of Insects, and by Dr. Richard Preece, our Curator of Malacology and resident snail expert. We also have an interview with one of our PhD researchers, Kate Howlett, who's looking at the link between biodiversity and wellbeing. Remember, if you have any questions for any of our experts, do post them in the comments on YouTube or send them to us on social media using the hashtag ZoologyLive. So let's get started. Dr. Ed Turner has been setting pitfall traps in his garden, and he's put together this film to show us how and why he does that.
Hello, it's a beautiful sunny morning. I'm going to try and use the chance to show you how to set a pitfall trap, which is one of the great ways of catching insects you wouldn't normally be able to find just by searching around the surface of the ground. I'm going to apologise because it's a beautiful sunny morning. All of my neighbours are out and doing stuff in their gardens. So you're going to have drills going off, lawn mowers, people going in and out of their sheds, all this kind of stuff. But that's probably the same sort of situation as you're going to be having when you're setting these things as well. So what I use for setting a pitfall trap, it sounds very grand, but all we're talking is a couple of cups set into the ground. These are what I usually use. Obviously we want to try and avoid using single-use plastic as much as possible. This is a big set of cups that I bought probably 8 or 9 years ago, and I use these quite regularly, and I like the foam ones because I think it keeps the insects nice and cool inside if I leave the traps out for a few days. So what I've got is just normal drinks cups. You can use anything really, and I've got 2 of them stacked together, and you'll see why in a sec. I've got a trowel, I've got a little bit of dead grass and moss. Moss is really good, which is going to be to keep the animals safe. I've got 3 very well used chopsticks, and I've also got just a plastic top. I've got a clear plastic top here, but you could just use any sort of plate or anything really. This is just to keep the rain off. So what we'll do is we'll start off here. Now I'm choosing the edge of the border here. And the reason is that insects, when they're moving along, will often be using these sort of features. They'll be walking along the edge. And I think if I set the trap here, I've got a better chance of catching stuff. So I'm going to go right in with a trowel, a bit like gardener's world, isn't it? And I'm not just digging up the soil just sort of like that. I'm actually doing a core. So I know roughly the size of the cup. So what I'm doing is I'm pushing in, you can see this, I'm pushing in the trowel like that to basically bring out, as close as I can, a complete plug of soil. And I'm going to put that really carefully next door here. So I'm aiming to disturb the area around the trap as little as possible, and that means insects are more likely to move in. I'm going to keep on doing that until I've got a hole which is roughly big enough. You can see things moving around already actually. Big enough to hold the trap. There we go. That's big enough, I think. I'm going to put that bit there. Now, I've got both the cups together, and you'll see why in a sec. So I'm going to put that cup inside that. We're only going to use the bottom one for the trap itself, but I'm going to keep them together because it means I'm going to have less soil going in. Now, I've made that a bit too deep, so I'm going to put a little bit of soil back in, and then I'm going to sit that snugly so that the bottom, the top of the bottom cup sits snugly with the soil surface, or a little bit below, and that's really key. What you don't want is your cup sitting out of the soil, because if you do, you won't really catch anything. It's got like a mountain for an insect. They're not going to climb over the top to fall into your trap. It has to be sunk in. So I'm going to put that there, and I'm going to use the soil, which I put carefully to one side, to backfill. Now really I want to be doing this with as little disturbance as possible. This is all falling apart a bit. So I'm just going to move it in. You can hear the soil going into the bottom of the trap. You don't really want that. So it's firming it all around. It's nice and stable all around the trap. And now I can see that the bottom bit, the top of the bottom cup, is completely flush, and that's really important. So now what I can do is I can put my finger on the bottom bit and pull it out, and that means the cup below is beautifully flush to the surface and it hasn't got much soil in it, so it's nice and clean. I can put the rest of the soil just back here, away from the cup, so that kind of keeps it all nice and clean. Now, the second bit of kit, which I've got around here somewhere, perhaps I'm sitting on it, are these chopsticks and the plate, or the plastic lid, as you can see here. Now, because it might rain and I don't want the things to get caught in the bottom in the water, I'm going to use this to protect it from the rain. But first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop in this little plug, vegetation, nicely stuck in, and that means anything that falls in has got somewhere to sit. And I'm making sure I'm pushing it into the bottom so they can't just use the bits of straw to climb up, so they can't escape. And I'm going to use 1, 2, 3, oops, sorry, 3 chopsticks, break off there, to fix this bit of plate in place. So just like that. So hopefully you can see it's not too high, but it just means that the whole cup is now protected from any rain. So any insects, the idea is, as they're walking along the edge of my border here, they can fall into the trap, and then what I can do is I can come back tomorrow morning, probably the same time tomorrow, and see what we've caught. Now, you don't want to leave your insects in there for too long, so probably 24 hours is really good, but it means you get the whole day-night cycle, and you get a really good idea of everything that's moving around your garden. Now, I've just set one here. Of course, what you might want to do is you want to set it in different parts of your garden, because there'll be completely different insects living on the edge of this flower border compared to the middle, compared to under my hedge, compared to under the trees, or even in the middle of your lawn if you're happy to sacrifice a bit of your lawn to put in a pitfall trap. And it's well worth doing this. It will give you a really good idea of everything that's moving around in your garden when you can't see it. So have a go at setting a pitfall trap today. Hello, a little bit of a colder day today, but I'm back to empty the pitfall trap we set yesterday and to find out what mini beasts we've caught during the night and this morning. And luckily my trap is still not being disturbed, which means that my 4-year-old didn't spot it. And what I'm going to try and do is just gently take out the chopsticks that are used to secure the plate on top, and also just really gently ease out the trap itself. When you're doing this, just be careful not to get too much soil in, because it can make it hard to see all other insects that have fallen in overnight. And this isn't a stage trap, this is genuinely what I've caught. So there's always a bit of trepidation at this point to make sure we've actually got something to show you. It has been very dry. If it's dry, you don't tend to get quite as much moving around, which can sometimes be a bit of an issue. To get a tap, I've done it over the tray here as well, you can see, so that basically, so I'm not going to lose anything. And luckily, I can already see things are beginning to move around, moving quite fast. So just shake the vegetation so I can show you this before they all disappear. Hope you can see this. This is a common woodlouse moving around the edge here. This is one of these decomposers in your garden. There'll be loads of these moving around. Hopefully you can see a little yellow, a black ant moving around here. This is the commonest species of ant in the UK. These are really, really common under patios and things. I know I get loads of these in my borders. That'll be a worker who's been walking around the surface trying to find things for the nest. And I also spotted when I was looking. Yeah. Again, if I don't know if you can see this, but there's a little black beetle here. In fact, there's a couple of them, which are rove beetles, staphylinnids. These are very often predators, so they'll be searching over the surface for other insects to eat. And when I first shook out that vegetation, one of the things I saw particularly were lots of little tiny springtails, things jumping around. And these are, again, really important decomposers. They're incredibly numerous in soil surface areas or just below the surface. And so there's loads of those in my border, and that's good news because it presumably means that the decomposition is going on my border, which is what I want as well, providing all the nutrients for the plants and things like that. So hopefully, what we've just seen, I've not looked properly yet, but a little bit of a snapshot of some of the wide variety of different insects and other mini beasts that are walking around the surface of your garden, the surface of your borders, day and night. And setting a pitfall trap like this is super easy to do, but it's one way you can actually meet these things, get up close and personal and meet some other insects and species that share the garden with you. And hopefully we're going to be encouraging you to all go out and set some pitfall traps like this and see what you can find in your own gardens over the coming week.
Okay, and I'm joined now by our Curator of Insects, Dr. Ed Turner. Hi, Ed.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, that's brilliant. Thank you. So thank you for sharing that with us. It looks like a really great way for us to be able to see some of the things that might otherwise go a bit unseen in our gardens. I thought I'd start off with actually one of the questions that's been asked through the comments, which is, what actually is a mini beast?
So a mini beast is a good catch-all term. So it basically means anything that's tiny, but usually we're talking about arthropods, other invertebrates. So very often what you'll be finding is insects. They're the most numerous probably. There'll be lots of crustaceans, so things like that woodlouse that we saw in that clip. That's a type of crustacean. So one of the few groups of crustaceans that made it onto land. And then of course there's other things like snails and slugs you'll be hearing more about from Richard later on. And of course worms and things like that. So we're talking about the small things, little things that run the world, that are charging around your garden. Insects, their relatives, and other tiny creatures.
Fantastic. So we saw you setting a pitfall trap in your video, and we've got things like woodlice and beetles and ants. Is this quite typical of what you'd find in a pitfall trap, or is there anything else that you might look out for?
I mean, that's quite typical. You get a huge variety of stuff though. The nice thing about pitfall traps is it's something you can set literally anywhere. So there's lots of other ways that you can catch mini beasts. You can do sort of suction sampling, and you can tap trees, and you can use sweep nets, and you can use butterfly nets, of course, for larger things. But they're all restricted to particular habitat types. They only work in certain areas. Whereas pitfall traps, you've got the ground everywhere. So you can use them in any habitat, and that means you can sample right across a whole range of environments and find a very wide diversity of things. Scientifically, it's very useful as well, because it means you can compare between habitats. That's the kind of thing we might do in some of my research. And in terms of what you can find, yeah, it can be anything, basically anything that moves over the soil surface, or even within the soil surface. If you set your pitfall trap a little bit lower, you can catch. So very often that's lots and lots of insects, but it'll be often predators. So I get a lot in my garden. I get a lot of these ground beetles in pitfall traps, not in the one we just saw, but very often when I do some, I do. And these are predatory beetles, and they'll often be moving around quite large distances sometimes to find other insects, the kind of things other insects won't want to meet if they're living in your garden.
Have you found anything particularly unexpected in a pitfall trap before? Or is it always just...
I'm trying to think. So there's a few kind of unusual things. You sometimes get, the reason I put the kind of the vegetation at the bottom is to keep things happy. So I found quite often I find toads sometimes, depending on where you're setting pitfall traps, which is slightly surprising. I've caught a lizard once, which is very exciting.
Wow.
So I've had quite a few. I think probably the most amusing one I've had was doing field work in Malaysia, where I came back and someone had actually set a replicate pitfall trap right next to mine from a drink they'd been having. So they replicated the whole thing. I don't know who it was, but it was really surprising.
So
you do catch literally anything moving on the surface, you'll catch.
So I'm guessing that includes spiders as well, because one of the other questions that we've had is, what's the most venomous spider that we get in the UK?
Goodness, I've got no idea actually. I'm not a spider expert, so I don't know which one's the most venomous at all, I'm afraid. It's probably one to ask Michael Pashkovich, who's my PhD student, who really is an expert on spiders. He'll be able to answer that question. But yeah, certainly you get loads and loads of pitfalls in pitfall traps. We get a lot of jumping spiders sometimes with more open habitat. They'll be moving across the soil surface, and they're quite easily trapped. Yeah.
So maybe that's one that we can
spiders
put
as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we can put the answer on that on our social media once we've asked Michael about it. And we've got a few questions coming through actually from people. So what benefit do woodlice have? What do they do? Because we saw really beautiful woodlice in your video.
Well, I think they're really important decomposers. So they feed on a whole variety of different things, but they're chewing up dead and decaying plant matter, which is probably their major job in the environment. And what that does is it exposes all the surface to more fungi and things like that, so it can speed up decomposition. They also can do a lot of that breakdown actually in their own gut as well, so they're important for that reason. And the other thing which lots of these invertebrates will do is they'll move things like fungal spores around the soil and stuff, so they can speed up things for that reason too. And I dare say because they're moving up and down in the same kind of way as an earthworm might, they'll probably be integrating all sorts of organic stuff in the top of the soil deeper down. So I think they're really, really important just in terms of what they're doing. Of course, the other side of things is that for birds and things, they're delicious. So they're also a big part of the food web in terms of providing food for larger, feathery, furry things.
And we've also been asked if if something like a moth fell into your pitfall trap, would it be able to fly out again?
So usually, yeah, if you're setting them for live things, which is what we were doing in the video, then definitely be able to fly out. Of course, if you're doing scientific sampling, sometimes we actually deliberately kill stuff. As part of scientific sort of sampling, we might want to keep a record of what's there. Of course, then no. But mostly, moths are pretty able. They can fly right out of the trap. In fact, sometimes I've found things that have moved in there. I think they're moths that spend time overnight or over the daytime actually hidden in the soil and they actually be kind of almost asleep in the pitfall trap. The other slightly unusual thing you can sometimes get in pitfall traps, which you might not expect earlier in the season, is queen bumblebees sometimes go in. And I think it's because often things like the buff-tailed bumblebee actually nest in the ground. They look for old abandoned mouse holes and things like that. And I think they look at the pitfall trap and they think they've found a little mouse hole. So they go in. It's a bit unexpected. Not normally what you'd find crawling over the surface.
Yeah. So we're getting loads of questions for you, actually. So Zoe asks, what are flies, bees, wasps, or animals with wings? What are their wings made out of?
They're basically a projection from the skin of the insect. So the skin of an insect is an incredibly complicated thing. It's basically it's chitin. It's lots of different proteins and stuff. It's a kind of matrix, a little bit analogous to fiberglass, I suppose, in that respect. So it can have a whole variety of different properties. This kind of protein matrix, these long chitin fibers, which basically means it's very, very strong. So different parts of an insect out of body can take on different functions. Some bits can have be very, very flexible. So things like the spongy joints in the leg of a jumping insect, for example. Or you can get things like the jaw pieces of insects, which can be hardened even with things like heavy metals. And there's loads and loads of cross links going on there between the chitin and between the protein, which means they're incredibly tough. So they can bite through plant material, they can bite through other insects, things like that. Of course, the wings of insects themselves are very, very strong. They're tough usually in just one or two directions, and they're incredibly light. So fantastically good for taking to the air. And of course, it was insects that first evolved the ability to fly.
Yeah, we always forget that when we think of birds, but no, insects were there a long time before birds were, weren't they?
Way before.
Way before. So another sort of question about insect anatomy. Do all insects and arthropods have compound eyes? Because there's beautiful sort of eyes made of lots and lots of lenses.
Ooh, that's quite a good question. So insects, yeah, generally speaking, although some insects can secondarily lose those complex eyes. More widely than that, I mean, other arthropods, yes. So I suppose other arthropods and insects, yeah, they usually have compound eyes, although they can lose them. They also have simple eyes as well, very often, which are called ocelli. So they're quite the right term, but kind of on the forehead of the insect. You can sometimes see three little dots, which look a bit like watch glasses, like little round glassy discs, and they're meant to detect the horizons. They're not complex eyes in the way that the compound eyes are. You can pick up all these complex pictures, but they can detect light and dark. And that means if you're a flying insect, you're flying along, the rule of thumb is you want to keep the light bit above you and the dark bit below you. And that way you're flying straight ahead, you're not crashing into the earth or flying up to the sky.
Yeah.
There's loads of information insects get from these very complex organs.
Yeah, they're really beautiful animals and so small, but so much complexity inside them, isn't it? So
yeah, incredible diversity.
Yeah. So we've also been asked is how rich or diverse is a garden habitat compared to, say, a woodland or an ancient woodland?
So it's quite, again, there's lots of really good but very, very tricky questions to answer. They're not straightforward ones. It depends on the scale you're looking at, is the answer to this, and also, of course, on the particular garden. So gardens have been, in some cases, reasonably well studied. And the longest running study was over 30 years by someone called Jennifer Owen, who lives in Leicester, I think, who wrote a very beautiful book about it. And she recorded, I think, nearly 2,000 species from her garden. I had to check that. Don't completely quote me on that, but it's around that kind of number. So it's an enormous number, of which a big chunk were insects, and a big chunk of those were parasitic wasps. Obviously, she was doing a really comprehensive survey. It illustrates that there's actually a huge diversity of things that can potentially be found in a garden setting. The garden kind of is a woodland, it is a grassland, depending on how you manage it. The tricky bit comes in that it depends on scale. So when you find this when you're sampling biodiversity, if you're research like myself, you can't just sample one area. I can't put in one pitfall trap and tell what's living in my garden or in a woodland. You have to see how much turnover there is, how many new species I get per trap. And if you imagine doing that lots and lots of times, what you'll end up getting is an increasing number of species being found over that whole habitat. And if the area is very, very different from one area to another, the number of new species will go up really sharply. And that will mean the total habitat is very, very diverse, no matter what it is per trap or per area. And the tricky thing is that changeover in species can be very variable between different habitats. It's quite hard to study that. My suspicion is that a garden will be very, very steep. So potentially, even though an individual garden may not be as diverse as an ancient woodland, if you look across the ancient woodlands and across the gardens, you might find that they really are quite diverse. I think it's an interesting project to look more at.
Yeah, and I'd be really interested to see the results of that. So we seem to have some more international people watching us today, saying, I know that pitfall trap is done in a temperate context in the UK, but will this work in a tropical context where I live?
Yes, certainly. So pitfall traps are a very common technique to use right the way around the world for any terrestrial insects. So it's certainly been used in deserts, in tropical rainforests, in salt marshes, in your garden. It'll work equally well anywhere. Again, think about what you're trying to do. If you're doing a scientific study, you might want to make sure, what we often do is we put in the pitfall traps either in a regular grid or in a random sample point using a GPS, and that makes sure we're not choosing where to go. If you're doing it just for fun, or because you're interested in finding out what's in your garden, be much more selective, and you can maximise your chances of catching particular things that you might be interested in. So as you saw in the video of mine, I often put pitfall traps just in the edge of borders, because it channels insects through, and I just know from experience I get more individuals doing that. If you're interested in your overall environment in your garden, perhaps you might want to choose to put in a pitfall trap in your border, under your hedge, in your open grassland, next to your pond. That will mean, again, you get a better flavour of everything that's going on. So it's not a random sample, but it's giving you perhaps a more overall better coverage of the different types of environments found in your area.
Okay. So we've been asked by Thomas, aged 8, what is the minibeast that surprised you the most?
So insects and other minibeasts are endlessly surprising, actually, I think, in terms of what they do. And there's an awful lot about their biology that we don't yet know, which I think is fascinating. So that's part of the reasons that I study them. The minibeast that's probably surprised me most is the one that I know the most about, and that's something called the Duke of Burgundy butterfly. It's a very rare species in the UK, and quite a lot of our research group work on it. And part of the reason for that is that it's been very understudied, something that's declined a lot in recent years, so its numbers have gone down. But we don't know very much about it. And I've really enjoyed studying it because we've found out things about it which haven't been found out before, I think. So, for example, we've identified bits of the habitat it really needs. It turns out it's a butterfly that comes out quite early in the spring. It's already finished. The adults are all finished for the year now. We won't see them again until May next year or the end of April next year. And it turns out one of the things they particularly do is they choose the most sheltered areas in the chalk grasslands they live in, and they're most active there. And it turns out that that's really their requirements. They come out early in the year. They get away with that by choosing the areas which are most sheltered and warmest, so they can get active early in the spring. And that's something our group found out that hadn't really been spotted in that detail before. So I think that's probably my favourite, because I know more about it. But you could study any species probably and find out just as many different interesting insights about its biology.
I mean, that links quite nicely onto a question from Connor, who's also aged 8. Why are butterfly wings so delicate, and what are they made of?
The answer to the wings are probably the same again. So the base material of the wing is basically just a projection of the cuticle of the insect, so the outer surface of the insect. So a mixture of these chitin, fibres and protein. The reason that they're very delicate is because they've also got lots of very special hairs on them. So the surface of most insects are covered in lots of hairs. And rather like our hairs, they can detect all sorts of things. They can detect movement of air. And with insects, they can also detect various chemicals and sometimes things like that, and stress. But the hairs on the wings of butterflies have been particularly specialised, become sort of flatter. So they become like scales. So they're called scales on the butterfly wings. And it's those that give the colour pattern of butterflies and moths. It also gives their name. Their proper name is Lepidoptera, which means scaly winged. So if you were to look at a butterfly wing under a microscope, what you'd see is that what appears to be a single colour is actually made up of loads and loads and loads of little individual scales, all making up that colour, and sometimes can be quite mixed. It's rather like slates on a roof or tiles on a roof. That's how it looks. So if you touch them or if you rub them with your hands, those scales will come off. So if you pick up a butterfly, you'll see the colour sort of on your hand afterwards, and that's the scales that have come off. That doesn't particularly hurt the butterflies. As long as you don't damage the wings themselves, they can still fly. But of course, they'll be stressed by that and things like that. So you have to be very careful when you pick them up. And of course, some people can actually react to the scales as well, rather than you. So that's the reason.
Okay. So I've just got a few more questions from people watching us today. Would you be able to catch a worm then in your pitfall trap?
Oh yeah, definitely. Very often catch worms, particularly if it's wetter. So worms will go out on the surface and crawl along the surface of the soil to get to new places or find new food and things when it's wet. And so if you're trapping during a wet time, you often get lots of worms.
Okay. And what about if a venomous spider fell in? Would you leave it alone?
Well, we're lucky in the UK in not having really any spiders to worry about. So I know I'd pick it up quite happily. But of course, you have to be careful of these things in other parts of the world to make sure you haven't got anything nasty that's dropped in. And people also use pitfall trapping on a much larger scale to catch snakes and things like that. It's a regular survey technique for snakes. Again, unfortunately, in the UK, that's unlikely to happen.
Yeah.
Although you can sometimes, I've known people to catch slow worms before in their traps.
Yeah. Okay. Are there any rare insects you could catch?
So, I mean, we live in a very under-recorded world with insects, but yeah, potentially. It depends where you're trapping, basically. If there's rare things that are living around the surface in where you're living, then yes, you could catch it with a pitfall trap. I've caught glowworms before, and I've been trapping on sort of reserves, which is quite fun. They're really, really beautiful. So you can catch quite restricted things depends on the habitat.
Yeah.
It's a very good survey technique.
Okay. And this is one question I've always wondered about myself. Is there an idea as to why beetles are so diverse?
Yeah, so it's a tricky one. I mean, I think there's probably two answers to this. I think one is they might be relatively as diverse as we think they are. I think that's partly because they're so collectible. They're just really, really appealing. And a lot of the collections, of course, are dating back again hundreds of years now. And people used to really like going out and collecting beetles, and I can completely understand that myself. The reason is they're so incredibly variable in form and shape. And of course, in the old days when people used to make their private collections, dried insect collections in cabinets, they preserve incredibly easily. So I think for that reason, they're relatively well recorded in that sense for a very diverse group. It's been suggested that things like flies could easily be equally or more diverse. It's just that there's not so many people have worked on them historically. I think that's reasonably likely. So perhaps flies will end up being the most diverse group. Who knows? It illustrates the point we live in a very undescribed world. More generally, I think that very often the insect groups, which are the most diverse, which includes beetles, includes butterflies and moths, includes flies, these are the groups which often have close associations with plants. And so it's been suggested that a lot of this diversity, this kind of speciation of these different groups, might have been driven by co-evolution between plants, particularly flowering plants, which are the other most diverse group, I suppose, of organisms, and insects. And there's a striking pattern there, where things which interact with plants tend to be more diverse, and of course plants are very diverse. We might be having this sort of powerhouse, this interchange, where more and more species are evolving as these things interact with each other.
Okay. So we've got a few more questions, and then I think we'll move on to Richard's film. But Linton, age
Very impressed
5,
with everyone's questions.
Yeah, they're brilliant, aren't they?
I thought it would just be us.
In Colchester, asks, why do bees have stingers?
Stings on bees are basically a way of defending themselves. So originally, these in way back before stings evolved, would have been for laying eggs. So they're sort of specialised egg laying devices. They've taken on this new function to basically defend the bee, and indeed in social insects to defend the colony.
Yeah. Okay. And
so you can see this actually with things like honeybees. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but if you were to, when people keep honeybees, if you go near the nest itself, when the nest is established, you have to be really, really careful, because honeybees can attack, and because they're defending the colony, particularly defending the queen. Of course, is laying all the eggs and things like that. So that's how they're reproducing. When you've got a group of honeybees which is founding a new nest, which they do sometimes in the spring, summer as a swarm, they're much less aggressive. They're not defending things. They'll tend not to use their sting then. I don't advise anyone to do this at all, but you can sort of get really close to those, and indeed even put your hand into the mass of them, and they won't sting you. I've done that. It's an amazing thing. So as long as you've got kind of faith, but I'm not advocating anyone does that just in case, because some people react very badly to them. But it illustrates that they're stinging for a reason. Yeah. It's to defend the colony. If the colony is moving around, they're nowhere near as aggressive, interestingly.
Okay, so I think one question that I think we'll answer later on anyway, is there a place we can record what we find?
There certainly is. So there's we're using iRecord, which I think you're going to tell people about, which is a fantastic way of making sure your records go right through, and that feeds through to things like the Biological Record Centre, which is incredibly important. We're very, very lucky in the UK in having probably the best biological records of nearly anywhere in the world, because it goes back such a long time. And nowadays, really anywhere you are will have these automated services. So you've got your powerful computer, your iPhone, your smartphone, you carry around with you. And that means you can really take a record wherever you are, and that can contribute to our understanding of the biological world anywhere in the world. That's really, really important. There's partly these kind of records that are letting us know how the natural world is doing and how things are changing.
Okay, so if you asked a question and we haven't gone through it, we have had loads, which has been fantastic, but we will answer them on our social media channel, so you will get an answer to any questions that hasn't come through. I've just got one last thing I want to ask Ed. This is one question that I'm asking everybody this week, and that is, do you have a top wildlife spot, or is there something that you really want to see and you haven't yet?
So I do actually. I really want to see. There's been a reintroduction attempt at somewhere called Rockingham Forest in Northamptonshire 2 years ago now, which was reintroducing something called the checkered skipper, which is a species of UK butterfly that went extinct about 40 years ago, something like that. And it's been reintroduced from stock, I think, from Belgium, and it's doing rather well. The population's thriving. So it's the first time you'll be able to see this species in the UK in 40 years. And it's surviving in this area. And I think this is a really nice one. I'd really love to see this. I've not been there and seen it during the flight season yet. And I think it's an example, I suppose, of hope, that if you get things right, you can bring back species that have disappeared in the past. So really great one to see, and it's a very beautiful butterfly.
Oh, I think that's a really lovely, hopeful message to end on. Thank you, Ed. That was really interesting, fascinating, and some really brilliant questions there as well from our audience. So thank you.
Yeah, no, some really kept me on my toes. So thank you very much for that.
Okay, and you'll be back on Saturday as well, won't you, to answer further questions? So people have still got questions.
Yeah, look forward to it.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot. Now, see you on Saturday. Okay. So now we're going to move from one group of mini beasts, the insects, so we looked at lots of other ones there, to another group of mini beasts. And we're going to be joining our Curator of Malacology, Dr. Richard Preece, as he introduces to some of the snails that he's seen in his garden.
I'm Richard Preece, the Curator of Malacology at the University Museum of Zoology, and I've been interested in shells for a very long time. I've been collecting them since I've been collecting them since I was a boy, and behind me here is a collection that I made as a schoolboy. I'm particularly interested in land snails, and believe it or not, there are actually about 100 species of land snail that occur in Britain. Most of you will be familiar with the garden snail and think that snails are this sort of size, but if I show you a drawer of these snails, you will see that many of them are very small indeed. These I had to collect with sieves from leaf litter or moss or flood debris, and I had to obviously identify them using a hand lens or a microscope. A lot of these you can find in gardens, and I think we'll go out into my garden and see what we can find today. So snails like to live in damp places, often on overhangs, and there we have one. Here is the common garden snail, Corneoaspersum. It's a pulmonate snail. That means that it doesn't have gills, but it has a sort of primitive lung. And if we look very carefully, we might see it breathe. You might see a hole opening up as it begins to breathe. So here is the garden snail, and here it is now breathing. You can see that hole opening up, allowing air to get into its mantle cavity. And if we're lucky, it might come out to crawl. No, it's a bit. Oh, here it comes. Here it comes. Out come the tentacles. Here we come. There we are. And in these snails, the eyes are at the end of the tentacles. In some species, the eyes are at the base of the tentacles. I've just found 3 more specimens. These belong to a different species, the brown-lipped snail. You can see so called because the aperture is brown coloured. There is another species that I have found in the garden which has a white lip, and that is another species. Like the garden snail, it's a pulmonate, and you can see it breathing as there's the hole opening up again, as we saw in the garden snail. Now these are patterned. They're much more colourful than the garden snail, and they are very variable. They can have up to 5 bands, or they can have no bands at all, or some of the bands confuse, as in these 2 shells. But they are all one species. They are not 3 different species. This is an example of what biologists call polymorphism. I've just found this snail in my garden. It's called the girdle snail because it's got a very sharp keel, and which is shown up in white there. This is an interesting snail because its native range is Mediterranean. It lives in a number of countries around the Mediterranean. It was known in Britain only from South Devon, where it was found in the 1950s. But in the last 20 years, it's spread very rapidly through Europe, Northern Europe, and Southern Britain. And its spread seems to be aided by climate warming and the increase in horticulture. Some snails are carnivorous, and they actually eat other snails. But the vast majority of land snails are herbivores. They can eat detritus and dead plant material, but many of them graze on living plant material. And we can see evidence of that. Here we have a flower pot covered in green algae, and if you look carefully you can see little wiggly lines going across it. The snails eat algae using a tongue which looks a bit like a file. It's called a radula, and as they pass over the surface of the flower pot, they graze the algae, leaving these very characteristic trails. Snails themselves form important food items for other animals. They're eaten by rodents, mice and voles, and of course they are very important food items for birds. Now birds have a problem in trying to get the animal out of the shell, and not all birds have learned to do this. Thrushes, for example, bash the snails on a particular stone called the anvil stone, but things like blackbirds have never learnt the trick. And here is a thrush's anvil. It's not one stone, but it's actually a little stone pavement. And if we look very carefully, we can see some of the snails that they've used for food. This one has had its top bashed out, and some of these others have been broken in two in order to extract the animal.
So I'm joined now by Dr. Richard Preece. Hello, Richard.
Hello.
Hello.
Have you been waiting for me?
No, it's fine. It's good. It's good to see you. And thank you for sharing those wonderful snails with us from your garden. It was really great to see even a small amount of the diversity out there. So are there any other sort of common species of snail that we might be able to find if we look in our gardens?
Well, yes, a lot of them are very small and it's not easy to show them to you, but I've got two that I can show you. This one is a very common snail. I think the English name for it is the strawberry snail, and I'm quite sure that it'll occur in every single garden in Cambridge. It's an extremely common snail. This one, slightly bigger, more white coloured. I get this a lot in my garden. It'll be a great enemy of any of the gardeners amongst you. Called the Kentish snail, and that will be very happy chomping away at nice succulent plants. So those two are very common garden snails as well.
Do you have any sort of tips on how to look for snails in gardens?
Yes. A good way to find snails is to turn over stones. Remember that many of these are small even as adults, so we're talking about 2 or 3 millimeters or so in size. So you've really got to get down and get up and personal with them. But if you're looking for others, I use these sieves. These are homemade sieves. They started life as flower pots, and they've had their bottoms cut out and mesh of different sizes put in, so you can put leaf litter and moss and sieve it and get the small snails in the bottom of the sieve. That's a very, very good way, and these sieves have accompanied me all over the world. I've collected snails in them everywhere. So.
Oh, that's a really good example of some recycling there as well. Very, very much approve of that. So once we've found our snails, what's the best way for us to try and identify what we've got?
Well, there are a number of books that you can get more easily and accessible. I've actually produced an identification sheet in which all this sheet just covers. It's called an illustrated guide to the land snails of the British Isles. So I produced it with a number of colleagues, and it's fully comprehensive. It illustrates each of the 99 species of land snail known from the British Isles. There is one on freshwater snails in preparation, and of course it doesn't deal with slugs, which are even more reviled by gardeners than the snails. I'll let that lie.
Yeah. So I've got a couple of questions now for you from our audience. So Owen, aged 9, which is your favourite snail and why? Do you have a favourite snail?
I do have a favourite snail. It's a very small snail. So if I can show you a picture, I'll show the real thing and a picture of it. So start with the picture of it, which is probably better than the real thing. There it is.
Yeah.
Can you see that?
Yeah,
can you see
that
it's nice, nice and golden coloured. I'll show you the real thing, which is probably a great disappointment, but it's very small. There it is. There are 2 of them that you can see it in relation to my finger now. Why is it my favourite snail? Oh, sorry.
If you just shuffle it over to your right a little bit. There we go. Fantastic.
Is that right?
Yeah.
It's very small. You don't get any impression of its true beauty. But the reason that I've chosen this as my favourite one is because it lives in beautiful habitats. It lives in woodland, usually in very scenically wonderful places. You get it in deep leaf litter or moss. And when you put it in the sieve, when you put a handful of moss or leaf litter in your sieve, these stand out as nice little golden gems in the bottom of the sieve, and it's a life-affirming experience.
Oh,
it's really nice.
Oh, lovely. So we've got a couple
But it's
more
also
questions.
quite rare. So you don't actually get them in this part of the world. They live mostly in the northwest of Britain, so I don't see them very often. And they've also got a very interesting geological history, which I'm also interested in.
Okay. So we've been asked, can you keep a snail as a pet, and are they good pets to keep?
You can. Some of them are more easy to keep than others, and many people keep giant African land snails as pets. I think there are people in the museum who have had them for a long time. I've never done that. I've kept them, some of the smaller ones, but never the African land snails. But I think, I think they are good pets by all accounts.
Okay. So what are snail shells made of? This is another question that we've been asked. What are snail shells
Okay.
made of?
So the shell itself is made of lime, calcium carbonate. There are two different sorts of lime, calcite and aragonite. They're composed of both in varying degree, but the non-marine snails are mostly aragonite, which is the less stable form of lime. And over the lime shell is a protein covering called the periostracum, and that's the sort of horny bit, the sort of organic bit. And sometimes that organic bit can be produced as spines or as hairs. The surface of the shell might be hairy in some examples, even in some you might find in the garden.
Mm-hmm.
So two components, an organic component and a lime component.
Okay, fantastic. So another question we've been asked, if you could see any type of snails, rare or common, what would it be?
If I could see any type of snail, rare or common?
Rare or common. I guess from anywhere in the world. Let's go for anywhere in the world.
Well, there's some wonderful snails that live in Asia called snorkel snails, because one of the problems that they have living in the tropics is firstly trying to keep moist, because it's very hot and they could easily dry out, and so they need to shut up shop. They need to close themselves into a shell, but that makes it difficult to breathe. So a number of them have developed these little tubes that connect with the outside world, that enables them to breathe. And these structures are amazing, these little tubes, and I'd love to see those in the wild.
Okay, so why is it that snails have shells? This is a question from Josh, aged 7. Why is it that snails have shells? Because do slugs have any shells at all?
That's an extremely good question. Most slugs do have some sort of remnant of the shell. Sometimes, I can actually show you. Some groups, this is a thing called testacella, can you see that? There we are. That is a shell that would live on the back of this particular slug. It's external. Obviously the slug itself, which is, about 2 or 3 centimeters long, can't possibly fit into that, so it serves no useful protective purpose. But other slugs, like the sort of speckled one that you might see in the garden, the sort of leopardy coloured slug, that has an internal shell, a little plate. And if you look on the soil amongst the plants in the garden, you've got a beady eye, you can see these little disc-like shells made of calcite, made of lime, that are preserved. And the big black ones that you all know and hate, they have little granules, like sugar granules inside, which are the final remnants of the shell. So there are various stages on the road to slugdom that involves the loss of shells in various forms.
Yeah, the road to slugdom. I think that sounds like a novel or something. It should be. So, can you tell us a bit about any parasites that prey on snails? That's another question that's come through.
Well, there are all sorts of snails have all sorts of parasites, the usual range of nematodes and all sorts of other things. There are other parasites. There's a thing called the slug mite, which certain species of slug, if you look carefully, have little mites running all over them, and they can crawl inside the respiratory pore, and they live there. So so all sorts of things. There are internal as well as external parasites, a whole host of them.
I've never heard of that. I'm learning something new every day at the moment.
Of course, the thing that snails are most notorious for is that they themselves are the intermediate host of a number of parasites of veterinary and medical importance. They are the intermediate host of liver flukes that are can infect sheep's livers and so on. And of course, they can transmit bilharzia and other diseases. They form the intermediate host for that. So there are a number of important parasites. And in fact, we know a lot about the ecology and the biology of certain groups of snails because of that very fact.
So is this why it's dangerous to let your dog go near snails then? Because you know it's not safe often.
Not really. Not in this country, but I'm talking about in the tropics in particular. I mean, you get this thing galba, which is the intermediate host of the liver fluke. That's a very common snail. You get it in damp meadows, beside any sort of wet ground. If you look, it's very common. But you really have to eat it, and I don't know whether dogs would eat that. Sheep graze, of course. Dogs don't.
Mm-hmm.
So that's different.
So Josh, age 7, has asked, how can you help a snail if it gets stepped on? Because I've felt that before when it's been raining and I've accidentally heard that crunch underfoot and I felt very guilty.
Yeah, well, they do have, if the damage isn't severe, they do have the capacity to regrow part of the shell. They can repair the damage. And in fact, if you look at some of the seashells, you can see damage caused by crabs that have attempted to try and eat the animal, and you can see crab damage on a lot of the shells. But on land snails, if the damage isn't severe, then they can regrow that. But if you've crushed it completely, I think it's a goner.
Oh gosh, okay. So we've also been asked if you've ever been to France and tried eating snails.
Well, I've eaten snails without going to France. I have eaten snails. To me, I think most of the taste seems to be the garlic sauce rather than the rather rubbery snail itself. But curiosity got the better of me, and I did eat them. But they were all right. But I've had better starters.
So I wanted to ask you a couple of questions myself as well. So you're our curator of Malacology in the museum. Can you explain to us what that means and tell us a little bit about our collections at the museum?
Okay, Malacology is the name for the study of mollusks, and it's often used in distinction from conchology, which is really just the study of the shell itself. So a shell collector might describe himself as a conchologist. A malacologist is interested in the shell and the animal that lives in the shell, and of course is interested in things like octopus and so on that don't have shells at all. So they're interested in the whole group, mollusks. So that's what malacology is. In terms of our collection, we've got a very large and quite a very important collection of international importance. A lot of it was collected by a chap called Robert McAndrew, who bequeathed it to us in 1873. He was a ship owner, and he was very interested in shells. So obviously he was trying to combine business and pleasure. So he was, whenever he was sent one of his ships out on business, he would often tow a dredge behind to see how deep shells got. Because in those days, I'm talking about the 1840s, 1850s, they believed that there was a zone without life at the bottom of the oceans, and they wanted to establish exactly how deep life went, in this case shell life, got. And we have a lot of his collection.
Okay, fantastic. So I have one last question for you. I think you may have answered it already, but it's one that I'm asking all of our experts this week, and that is, do you have a top wildlife spot that you've made? It doesn't have to be a snail. I won't judge you if it's not a snail at all. Or is there something that you would really like to see?
Oh, gracious. Well, I've told you the snail I'd like to see, both in this country and indeed in Asia, so I better choose some. I mean, I've seen these films of birds of paradise, and I have to say they look a bit wonderful. but it looks as if it's a real trek to get there. I don't know whether I'm quite up to hacking through the jungle to do that, but and I might get waylaid on the way looking at what's in the undergrowth. But anyway, that would be something to look at.
Yeah, that would be something really special. So thank you so much, Richard. That was all really, really fascinating. And I hope that people can get a slightly more positive outlook on snails. They get a bit of a bad press, and they're really beautiful animals.
Well, many of them are extremely rare and do need conservation effort, particularly those that live on islands, oceanic islands. They are very severely threatened by habitat loss, forest loss, and so on. Many of them are pests, and obviously get rid of them, but yeah, they do need our help.
Yeah, we need to give snails a bit more love. Yeah.
Okay. One statistic I must say, 40% of the extinctions, animal extinctions that have occurred since 1600 have been mollusks.
Really?
So that's a very important, So you need to, so they do need friends.
They do need friends. Okay, well, thank you so much, Richard. So far today, we've seen some really fascinating mini beasts, and these animals are essential to the way our ecosystems function. But also, biodiversity is important for our own health and well-being, and this is the area of research of our next guest, a PhD student, Kate Howlett. So, hello, Kate. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Good. Could you describe your research to us?
Yeah, of course. So I am interested in the link between people's well-being and spending time in nature. So we have a whole lot of evidence that suggests that spending time outside in green spaces, in the presence of nature, benefits both our mental and our physical well-being. But a lot of this research has been done on adults. So I'm interested in this work in children. And specifically in primary school children. So I've been working with primary schools in the UK to think about how we can make maybe their school grounds greener and bring more nature into the school grounds, and how that might benefit or affect their well-being or their engagement with ecology and the natural world more generally.
Okay, that sounds really fascinating. How did you get into this sort of area of research?
It's a good question. I think like most people, you just sort of find something that's interesting and you run with it. So for me, it was when I was doing my undergraduate degree, I picked a module in ecology, to be honest, because it had a field course, which meant I could go outside, and I knew I liked going outside, and it was lots of fun. And on this module, we were thinking about why biodiversity is important and how we can benefit from it. And of course, there are the obvious things like flood management, soil production, all of the things that are more ecologically based. But then there's also this whole other set of things that we can benefit from more directly and to do with our health and well-being. And I think that sort of, it struck a chord with me because I suddenly thought, how have I never thought about this relationship between people and the outside before? And since then, I've just really been interested in it.
Yeah. Are you able to share any of the findings that you've been making with your research?
I can do briefly. So I think the most interesting things I've found are some differences between urban and rural schools and the children that go to these schools, but not necessarily in the way that I was expecting. So last year I went to a group of schools and did some surveys on their grounds, using a lot of the techniques that I think we're going to be talking about in Zoology, to survey for minibeasts and things. But I also looked at the number of tree species and bird species in the school grounds. And what I found was that actually a significant difference between the number of tree or bird species in rural schools versus urban schools. So I thought I was going to find a whole load more species of trees and birds in rural schools and fewer in urban, but that didn't seem to be the case. There was certainly a lot of variability between what you found between schools, but it didn't necessarily correlate with urban versus rural. But what was different was the number of wildlife-friendly habitat features in the grounds. So these are things, again, that we're talking about on Zoology this week, like insect hotels, ponds, all the things that you can put in to encourage wildlife to do really well. And it seems that there are more of these in rural schools than urban schools. So it looks like the rural schools are able to actively engage with their wildlife more, even if they don't have more tree and bird species, which is really interesting.
That's really fascinating. Yeah. So if there was anything that you could change about our cities or our environments where we're living and working, what would you change about them, do you think?
I think I would make them messier. So I think the most important thing is the fact that people have this perception that our green spaces should be neat and manicured and look very nice with mowed lawns, like nicely cut hedges and trees. And there are reasons for that. In certain circumstances, of course, if you want to play football, for example, or even have a picnic, you might want shorter grass, of course. But I think it contributes to this idea that there are green spaces for us that we can use, and then there are green spaces for nature that are separate. And you see this coming through in children as well. So when I was at schools last year, I had children say to me when we went out looking for minibeasts in their grounds, if there was an area of longer grass, some of them might say, "Oh, this is really overgrown. This should be cut." So it's because they're used to seeing cut grass everywhere. That's how people think the natural world should look. And I think if we were more used to seeing grass verges, for example, or parks, school grounds, maybe gardens and workplaces, if we were lucky enough to have a little courtyard area, if we were just used to seeing a bit more mess in the plant growth everywhere, longer grass, nettles, uncut bushes, that might go some way to improving our connection with nature. So I think that's good.
Yeah. No, I have to say the wildflower meadow in front of King's College is just fantastic, isn't it? It's that kind of thing. It shows that it's really beautiful. Yeah. And
And
has your
people's
work?
responses to that have been good. Sorry, people's responses have been really positive as well. I
Yeah.
haven't heard
Yeah,
anyone
absolutely.
it's horrible. Everyone so,
Yeah, I'd much prefer to see that than a manicured lawn, definitely. So, has your work been affected by the lockdown at all?
yes, in the sense that I can't get out to schools and engage with real children
Yeah.
in real life as I had planned to. So instead, this year I've sort of slightly adjusted the question I've been asking. Clearly, lockdown, the restrictions that have been put on people have affected our ability to go out into green space, and this might be different depending on where you're living. So rural people maybe are lucky enough, if it's on their doorstep, maybe they've been spending more time outside since lockdown. But potentially urban people might have been spending much, much less because they can't go out to the parks and the spaces they're further away. So I've designed an online survey for the parents of primary school children, that's aiming to ask the questions about how the lockdown restrictions have changed how their children have been using green space. So have they been spending more time outside or less? Has it changed people's perceptions of how important it is for learning as well as well-being and general health?
Yeah. Okay. That sounds really. Yeah. Be really keen to see what the results of that are. It sounds fascinating. We've had a question come in. So lots of us haven't been to school for a while. Will there be more wildlife living there now, do you think, in the schools, since the kids haven't been there for a little while?
That's a really good question, and I think it will potentially depend on the management that's been used in the school grounds during lockdown. So I don't know whether mowing those school fields would have been a priority for teachers, given that they've had so much else to do.
Mm-hmm.
So if, for example, maybe the school field has missed out on that mow that it should have had at this time of year and the grass has become longer, potentially when you go back there might be loads of mini beasts running around that weren't there before, which could be exciting. And of course those spaces would have been left quiet. So anything that is around, like foxes maybe, or deer, if you're lucky enough to be more rural, might have been making more regular use of it. So yeah, maybe.
Maybe. Oh, that'd be really interesting to find out. So I have one last question for you, and it's the one that I'm asking all of our experts this week. And that is, do you have a top wildlife spot, or is there something you'd really like to see and you haven't yet?
I think I might cheat this a bit. I think my wildlife spot might be a sound.
Oh, yeah,
Because
that's fine.
so I grew up in London, which is an urban area, and I'd never heard a cuckoo ever before. But I knew that they were synonymous with spring because you read about it in poems and stories and literature, but I'd never heard one. And then now that I'm living just outside of Cambridge in a much more rural area, this spring for the first time I heard a cuckoo, and it was beautiful and it was so exciting. So I'm really pleased with that. I think it's highlighted how important it is for urban people to make that effort to go a bit further out into green space, because you do get different stuff.
Yeah, no, I do love to hear a cuckoo. It's so atmospheric, that song. It just really makes you feel, yeah, I love it, love it. So thank you so much for joining us today, Kate. That was really, really interesting. And Kate's written a couple of blog posts for us. So if you check out our blog, you'll be able to find out more about Kate and her research as well. So thank you, and I'll see you soon. So biodiversity is important for our habitats and our ecosystems to work, but it's also really important for our health and well-being. And this links really nicely to our first challenge for this week. This is our Zoology Live Wildlife Challenge. What we want you to do is turn citizen scientist and record the wildlife that you're seeing on your patch. We're using a website called iRecord to collect and share your wildlife sightings. Now, you don't have to be an expert and be able to identify your sightings in order to do this. Upload photos and they'll be checked and verified by experts through the website. And the data collected by iRecord is really important. It's used by scientists and conservationists in decision making and helping them to understand how our natural world is working and how healthy it is. So how do you take part? You can register for free for an account. Once you've set up an account, you can log in on a computer or using the smartphone app to add your own records and images for others to see, as well as look at what other people have recorded. We've set up a Zoology Live 2020 event on iRecord, so do go there to add your sightings once you've logged in. And remember, upload a photo of your species so that we can all see it. We'll be sharing what you've been finding in our shows on Saturday. And you don't have to be in Cambridge to take part. We'd love to see what you've been finding elsewhere in the country too. Matt Hayes, our research assistant in the museum, has put together a fantastic how-to guide that you can find on our blog. It takes you through it all step by step, so I do recommend going and having a look there. We look forward to seeing what you find. That's all we've got time for on Zoology Live today. We hope you enjoyed it. Do feel free to fill out one of our feedback forms. You can find the link down in the show notes. We hope to see you back here at 4 o'clock tomorrow, where we'll be talking butterflies and dragonflies and damselflies, and we'll also be setting our Recycled Makes challenge. So until then, goodbye.